Okay, we were in the middle of siman mendek, and we got up to this is actually a famous sugya because it has many ramifications in many areas on halakha. And this is the sugya of hazmana milta. Okay, in other words, just a little bit of background for our purposes. We know we have items that have kedusha and items that have our mitzvah. So, for example, tefillin are an item of kedusha. Tzitzit are an item of mitzvah. It doesn't have kedusha. So the difference is, tefillin you would need to put in gniza if you no longer have use for them. On tzitzit you're not obligated. Kedusha, in addition to the item itself having kedusha, tashmishei kedusha, anything that serves the item also attains a certain level of kedusha. And the nafkamina of that is that I cannot use it for a dvar chol. Once an item it has the status of a tashmish kedusha, I cannot use it for chol purposes. And also, when it's no longer in use, I have to put it in gniza, as opposed to tashmish mitzvah, which doesn't have that. If an item is what we call tashmish, the tashmish kedusha, in other words, it's not even serving the item of kedusha directly, it's serving an item which then serves an item of kedusha, then it doesn't have the same status. Like just for an example, our tefillin, so the tefillin, the batim itself are kedusha. The houses that we sort of put the tefillin in, right? The plastic things that the plastic boxes that you usually cover our tefillin with are a tashmish kedusha. Usually the tefillin bags that we have, there's a debate on it, but some would claim it's only a tashmish kedusha. Why? Because it's not covering the tefillin directly. You first have the plastic box, and then only then you have the bag. So that would make it a tashmish kedusha, unless there are some that you want to claim that maybe the ritzuot of the tefillin also have kedusha, although the pashtut they don't. Only the batim themselves have kedusha. But some wanted to say, we've mentioned this in the past, I think, that because you take the ritzuot and you make with them the shapes of the letters of the dalid and the yud, so that gives them and the shin by the tefillin shalosh, then maybe gives them also status of kedusha, and then the ritzuot are not covered by the plastic boxes, and then the bag maybe also has a status of tashmish kedusha. But anyway, that's the fundamental principle of kedusha and tashmish kedusha. Now,
so the plastic bags around that, either way, probably it's even further removed.
If you have another bag around the bag of tefillin, that's for sure only a tashmish. So again, it happens often. You want to stick a bag of tissues inside, or your car keys, or who knows what you want to stick inside. So that's the question whether you can. So for sure, in the plastic bag, you can put it in the bag which has the talit, right? Because we'll see that explicitly, because it's not just serving the tefillin, it's also serving the talit. And the talit are a tashmish de mitzvah. Now, where does the question of Azmana Milta arrive? The question of Azmana Milta is, let's say I haven't yet used it for the Kedusha, I just designated for that use. Does something obtain this level of Kedusha just by the Hazmana, the designation, or only if I actually used it for the Kedusha itself, only then it gets that status. So we saw it last week, or last time, 2 weeks ago, regarding Tfilin Shel Rosh reducing to a Tfilin Shel Yad. But if I haven't yet worn it as a tefillin shel rosh, it doesn't yet have the expert kedusha of tefillin shel rosh, and therefore I can convert it into a tefillin shel yad. Why? Because we paskin hazmana lav milta. We'll see now the issue of hazmana milta or hazmana lav milta a little bit more in detail. And actually, the source for this whole machloket is not about tefillin or other items. It's actually about oreg tachrichin lemet. Somebody who prepares clothing, the tachrichin for the met, right? Once you put on the clothing of the met, right, it all becomes asr for use, right? The met is asr behana, and also the tashmishim of the met. So the question is, let's say I sewn clothing for the met, but I haven't yet put it on the met. Does it already have the status of the big day hamet, and therefore I wouldn't be able now to use it as clothing for anybody else, or for a person. Let's say I decide now I want to wear them myself, or do we say hazmana lav milta, and therefore the designation is not enough only when it actually gets put on the mate. So let's just see that inside, because the sugya, it's important to see it so that we understand some of the machlokot. So this is a Gemara in Masechet Sanhedrin, in Zayin Amud Bet Memchet Amud Aleph. Itmar ha'oreg beged lemet, Abaye amar asur, v'Rava amar mutar. Right. So Abaye holds hazmana milta, and therefore just the fact that I sewn it for the met already gives us the status of the met. The Rav big emet, the Rav amar mutar, no, I can use it for something else. Abaye amar asur hazmana milta. The Rava amar mutar hazmana lav miltai. Okay, now my time at Abaye, where did Abaye learn it out from? That hazmana milta. Gamar sham yigla arufa. Ma igla arufa be'azmana mitzara. Hainami be'azmana mitzara. In other words, once I've taken the igla arufa, as Rashi here says, Yiridatan lenachal eitan yosarta. In other words, once I've taken the igla down to the nachal, even though I haven't yet done the whole procedure and whatever, and placing the hands on the igla arufa and everything that I need to say there, it already has the status of a igla arufa that it becomes asur behana. So we see from there hazmana milta. ורבא גמר שם מעבודה זרה. מעבודה זרה בהזמנה לא מצרה, אף הכנה מבהזמנה לא מצרה. Rava learns it out from avodah zara. In other words, if I take an item and I say this is I'm makdish it to avodah zara, it does not yet obtain the status of avodah zara because hazmana lav miltai. So Rava learns out from avodah zara a general principle, and not just by avodah zara, but in all areas of halacha, hazmana lav miltai. Okay, now the Gemara says, Rava, my time lo gamar mi igla rufa. Why didn't he learn out from igla rufa? Amar lach meshamshin mi meshamshin gamrinan. Lapuke igla rufa dehi rufa kedusha. In other words, igla rufa is not comparable to the begadim of the mit. Why? Because the igla rufa is itself the item which is kedusha. In other words, it is itself is the item which becomes asur be'ana. So that is more comparable to the mit itself, as opposed to the begadim of the mit. That's only a tashmish. So I can't learn it out from igla rufa, even though by igla rufa has mana milta, that's only because it itself is the kedusha. But the begadim for the met, which is only a tashmish, I can't learn out from igla rufa. That I need to learn out from avodah zara. But if I take an item and I makdish it to avodah zara, that this will be meshamish to avodah zara, then hazmana, it doesn't have the status of a tashmish avodah zara yet. So therefore, I can't learn out from it. Now, this is an important point in the Gemara because some Rishonim, there's a machlokit Rishonim on this point, but we'll see it in the Mishnah Berurah. Some Rishonim learned from here that even though according to Rava, hazmana lav milta, okay, that's only regarding tashmishei kedusha, but regarding kedusha itself, hazmana milta. In other words, when the Gemara here said lapuke igla rufa di gufa kedusha, again, there's a machlokit Rishonim on this point. Some say no, igla rufa is different, but some Rishonim say no. We see from here that by kedusha itself, Rava is modeh to Abaye that hazmana miltahi. Okay, so how would that be a nafkamina by tefillin? The nafkamina would be that by the bay itself of the tefillin, or the klaf of the tefillin, by that we would say hazmana milta, and it would have the kedusha. Even though a person hasn't used it yet, he hasn't worn the tefillin yet, once it was made, it would already have the kedusha of tefillin. Okay, and that would be the nafkamina. So we'll see it in the Mishnah Berurah, if I take a klaf and I prepare it to write tefillin on it, I wouldn't be able to use it for some whole purposes. Okay, now the Gemara also says, and this is the part in the Gemara which applies to tefillin, the Amar Rav Chisda Haisur Asudra de Azmenei leMeitzar Beit Tefillin, V'tzar Beit Tefillin Asur leMeitzar Bei Pshitei. In other words, if I take a cloth and I designate it to wrap with the tefillin with it. In other words, it will serve as the tefillin cover. And I put the tefillin inside and cover it. I cannot use it also to hold money, okay? Because once it's designated for kedusha and used, right? Then it has kedusha, and I can't use it for a davar chor. In other words, if I designate it, but I haven't used it yet, so again, hazmana lav milta like Rava. And let's say I did use it, but I never designated. Also, I can use it now for money. Why? The Gemara says because in other words, even if I happen to use something for tefillin, that doesn't necessarily make it a tashmish kedusha. Only if I was azminei. In other words, if I designated it to permanently use it for tefillin. Okay, that's what Rashi here says. In other words, it happened to be I needed something at that moment to cover the tefillin with, so I used it. I took a bag and I put the tefillin inside. It doesn't mean that now it's going to be a tashmish kedusha, that it's designated for that. It's just a karai bag. Okay, so we see from here that according to Rava, and this is how we paskin, that hazmana lav miltahi, just the designation is not enough. On the other hand, just the use of it also is not enough. I need to make it a tashmish kedusha. I need two things to happen. I need to be mazmin it, to designate it, and also to actually use it. Okay, so if I take a bag, I designated it for tefillin, and I use it with the tefillin, only then it has a status of tashmish kedusha. Okay, now there are a few points here in the Rishonim on this. First of all, when we say hazmana, milta or lav milta, what is the definition of hazmana? Is hazmana just that I think to use it for something? Do I have to say it? Or is there an actually action involved? Okay, now you'll ask me, what's the nafkamina? We anyway pass in hazmana lav milta, but there is a nafkamina, because even according to Rava, the hazmana is significant, because only if I use it following the hazmana, it has kedusha. So even Rava requires the hazmana, and then followed by use. Okay, so we'll see. Many Rishonim say they learn out from the fact that the Gemara said ha'oreg beged lemet, that just hazmana, just to have in mind something, doesn't count unless I actually do a ma'aseh. Okay, if I did an action, that's considered hazmana. But if I didn't do an action, I just had in mind, okay, I'll use this, that doesn't count. Yeah. Tosfot here says that. Tosfot says as follows: צריך לומר דייחוד דדיבור בעלמא לא מהנה, אלא אם כן תלו ואמר זה יהיה למת ולספר. והיידה נקט ההורג לאו דווקא משום רבותא דרבא דאפילו אחי שרי. Okay, in other words, that Tosfot says yichud and even dibur is not enough. Unless I actually pick it up and say this is what I'm going to use it for. Okay. Another point, which is a machloket rishonim. This is something the Nimuki Yosef brings, is as follows, that if I had in mind, he says, Pirush bo Rava Chazal, דלאו דווקא צר בי תפילין הדף קביעות, אם כן פשיטא, ועוד היכא לימא דצר בי ולא אזמיני שרי למיצר בפשיטא, דמכל מקום הנחת תפילין זו, הביא אל ההזמנה ומעשה גמור וחי לקדושה אלי. והלא תליה בפלוגתא בארי ורבא כלל, אלא אפילו צר בי רבא תפילין לפי שעה כאמר, כיוון דאיכא הזמנה מעיקר או מייסא דהשתא, אף על פי שאינו אלא דרך אחראי מאוד דרבא דמילתא. In other words, what he says here is as follows. Let's say when I put in the tefillin inside, I had in mind that I'm putting the tefillin there forever. So in that case, again, the Nimuki Yosef afterwards brings somebody who's cholik on this, but we'll see that this is brought lahalacha. If at the moment that I use it for the kedusha, I also had in mind that this is going to be a permanent use. In other words, I put the tefillin in the bag. I had it in mind that I'm going to use it now permanently, this bag for tefillin. That's considered hazmana and a ma'aseh at the same time. Okay, why? Because I have the thought to use this now permanently for tefillin, and I'm doing the action of putting in tefillin inside. So that's hazmana plus a ma'aseh all in one action, and that would give it the status of tishmish kedusha. So when does the Gemara say no? If I put in the tefillin, it's not enough. Only if I had hazmana mikara. That's when I put in tefillin. I wasn't intending to put these tefillin in there forever. In other words, let's say I took a bag and I designated it. I did some sort of ma'aseh, or like Tosfot says, I picked it up and I said, this is going to be my tefillin bag. Okay, and then I did that, and I didn't yet put in tefillin. Tomorrow I come with tefillin, and I put them inside. And when I put these tefillin inside, I didn't have in mind that these tefillin were necessarily going to be forever there. But the hazmana that I previously did, plus the ma'aseh of actually using it, that's what gives it the kedusha. If I was just putting the tefillin randomly, without having done the hazmana yesterday, it would not give it the status of kedusha. But if when I put in the tefillin, I have in mind that I'm going to use it now permanently, that's hazmana and ma'aseh all in once, and it would have the status of kedusha. Okay, with all that background, I think we can go and see the Shulchan Aruch and the Mishnah Berurah. Okay, so he says as follows, the Mechaber says as follows, Sudar de'azminei lemeitzo beit tefillin leolam. In other words, the sudar that I said I'm going to use it for tefillin forever, to cover tefillin with it forever. V'tzar beit tefillin, and indeed he put inside tefillin, chad zimna, even once. Again, even though when I put it in, I didn't necessarily have in mind that these tefillin would be there forever. But because I had the hazmana initially, that I'm going to use this bag for tefillin, plus I used tefillin once, even though that use wasn't necessarily a permanent use, I cannot put inside money. In other words, I cannot use it for a whole purpose. Aga, says the Rama, if I make a t'nai initially that I don't want it to have the status of kedusha and I'll be able to use it for a davar chol, then it's not a problem. Okay, the klaf המעובד לשם תפילין, אסור לכתוב עליו דברי חול. דזמנה כי היגבנה לגוף הקדושה, מילתא היא. Okay, that's what we said based on the Gemara on Nigla Rufa. This is what some Rishonim hold, and this is what the Rama paskins, that if we're not talking about the Tashmish Kedusha, we're talking about the Kedusha itself, then Hazmana gives it the Kedusha. So therefore, if I I made parchment, right, with the whole tanning procedure, converting the leather into parchment, and I did it the same Kedusha Tefillin, right, because we know you do need to do the Ibud Lishma, then it already has a status of Kedusha, even though it's just a Zmana. Nobody ever wore these Tefillin yet. Nevertheless, it has the status of a Davar Shebekdusha, and on the item of Kedusha itself, Hazmana Miltei. So therefore, I cannot write on it now to use it for Divrei Chol. Okay, let's finish up the Shulchan Aruch. If I didn't designated it, if I designated it, but I didn't put the tefillin inside, then again, that's just Hazmana, so it doesn't have Kedusha yet. Or even if I used it for tefillin, but I never had in mind, that I was never mazminit and I didn't have in mind to permanently use it for tefillin, then I can use it for money. In other words, I can use it for a davar chol because it doesn't have the status of tashmish kedusha. Okay, let's see a few points here in the Mishnah Bura. So he says Sudal. סודר דאזמני, והוא הדין אם עשה כיס מחדש לצורך תפילין, גם כן אין איסור להשתמש בכל עד דצר דאזמנה לאו מילתאי. והוא הדין לכל תשמישי קדושה, אפילו תיק לספר תורה. In other words, even if somebody has a factory for making tashmishi kedusha, and he sewn this to be a tefillin bag, nevertheless, it wasn't just hazmana that he thought to use it, he actually made it for that purpose. Nevertheless, still hazmana lav milta, and it doesn't have the kedusha. And he says here, tashmish, the tashmish ain't bo kedusha plan. That's what we spoke about, that the tefillin bag, at least the laniudaiti, since the boxes are already covering the tefillin, that would be a tashmish, the tashmish, it wouldn't have kedusha. Okay, he says the azmenei, afilu bedibo bilvad, v'kol shekedim nitalo v'amar zeh letfilin demehane. Okay, here in the Be'er Halacha has a long arifut on this. It's not so pashut to say that hazmana just the dibur bilvad works. As we said, Tosot says explicitly dibur is not enough, and he brings here in the Be'er Halacha also a ran. It's a machloket rishonim. He says here. So he says maybe he says here at the end of the Be'er Halacha tzarich le'iyun lemaise b'hazmana b'dibur bilvad. Maybe hazmana b'dibur bilvad would not be considered hazmana only if you actually picked it up and said that zeh letfilin. In other words, it would be considered hazmana that if I used it afterwards for tefillin, it would have kedusha. Or if I actually did a maaseh, like I did some sort of fixing, or I wove it to be a tefillin bag, that would definitely be a davar hazmana. Okay, here he says, ותיק של טלית לא מקרה תשמיש קדושה, רק תשמיש מצווה. לכן מותר להניח בו שאר דברים של חול, דאף דמונח בו גם כן טליק של תפילין, לא הווה התיק של טלית כי אם תשמיש דתשמיש. ואפילו אם ניתן בתוכו הסידור שלו, דיש בקדושה או התפילין בלא תיק, מכל מקום בעת הצורך מותר ליתן בתוכו דברים של חול, ללא איסורים תחילה, גם לטלית הוא דבר של חול, והווה כאילו יגנע. Okay, so he says, first of all, the talit bag, even if I also put the tefillin inside, that doesn't have the status of tashmish kedusha. Why? Because it's also used for the talit, which is not a kedusha. Now he says, interestingly, ואותם האנשים הולכים בדרך ומשתמשים בשק של תפילין בדברים של חול, אף דמדין אסור, אף על פי כן יש ללמד עליהם זכות, דכיוון דרגילים בכך, אבל כאילו יתנו בתחילה, ואף על פי כן לכתחילה נכון לעשות כן. In other words, people who are putting in the tefillin bag itself things של חול, which לכאורה is asur, he says, there is a limud zchut on them. In other words, since it's something that they are normally do, we could say it's like they made a t'nai mikara, that they can use it for davar chol, but he says that only and there's a limud zchut, not to do it lechatchila. Again, as I mentioned, in our tefillin bags, now that we have these plastic coverings, I think there is more room to be lenient to stick other things inside. Now we said lemeitza beit tefillin leolam. In other words, hazmana has to be forever. So he brings here a machloket. יש אומרים דווקא בפירוש, אבל בסתם לא אמרינן דאזמתו הוא על עולם. Okay, in other words, the machloket here is, do we say that stama is le'olam or stama is only lefisha? In other words, like I didn't really think it through how long I want to use it for. B'tzarbe, he says here, כל זה בסודר או כיס שלו, ואין אדם מוסר דבר שאינו שלו. In other words, I can only give an item of kedusha, status of kedusha, if it belongs to me. It doesn't belong to me, I cannot take somebody else's bag and put it fill inside and give it the status of tashmish kedusha. Okay.
What about the plastic coverings for the tefillins? For example, since you have initially a hazmana, basically you don't make them anywhere for just tamazoi, but you really make it in the shape of a tefillin. Do you say it's a hazmana, and therefore, for sure, let's say I'm asking practically because about last year I wanted to buy, these army tefillin capsules. Right. And inside there's this stronger, very nice, that has both sides, even the place where you can roll up the retua. And the question is, since they make it for tefillin, would you consider it straight away hazmana tefillin and therefore straight away kedusha or
you mean they make boxes that cover the tefillin directly?
Yes. I mean, it's basically this nicely made black plastic covers around the tefillin itself, instead of this.
Besides the box that they have, they also have coverings.
Yeah.
So
Would
again, it would be hazmana, but since it's a tashmish kedusha, hazmana lav miltai. So unless I actually put them tefillin inside them, it wouldn't have kedusha. But once I put tefillin inside, even if I didn't have it in mind le'olam, since they made it for that, it has a samana, so even if I used it once for tefillin, then it would become tashmish kedusha. If I never used it, then no. So let's say I bought it, I never used it actually used it for tefillin, so then I could throw it away without kedusha.
What if you were just to try it out, whether it fits your tefillin, and it turns out that it doesn't fit your tefillin?
Good question. And look, if it doesn't, what do you mean it doesn't fit? If I put the tefillin in,
let's say your tefillin is not the same size. They're usually the standard tefillah gasa nowadays, but maybe your tefillin is a little bit smaller, and you say,
and well, shaking inside. Okay, maybe you could say, I don't know. Maybe you could say that's not considered. It's not considered that I used it yet. If I was just testing it, I immediately used it. I could hear the argument. If I put it inside and I haven't yet made up my mind if I'm going to use it or I'm going to go my plastic coverings, then I would say you did hazmana and then you used it, so that's it, unless you made a specific tnai.
Okay. Couldn't one say that it says that since they're not fitting, the hazmana doesn't count because you will not use it le'olam?
Yeah, no, I mean, it still has hazmana. I mean, they made it, when they made it, they did hazmana. They didn't make it, they made it for somebody's tefillin. They didn't know it would end up in yours and it wouldn't fit you. I think it is hazmana. But you could say, like, if it never fit, it's not even considered salbe. In other words, salbe means I used it. But here, I put it inside, I immediately something's wrong and I took it out. So maybe that's not considered, that I've ever used it. But if I used it and then after a day or two, I decided, the size is not good, whatever, then I think it would be, because I did use it and I had hazmana, so I think it would be considered a tashmish kedusha. Right. He says here, interestingly, that Katan, who also used it, would be hazmana milta, even by a katan. So in other words, even he's not yet bar mitzvah, but he used it for tefillin, again, because it's a maise, not just hazmana, but plus a maise, then it would be would have kedusha. Chadzimna, he said, that's what he says here. אף שהיה רק לפי שעה דהו דרך הרי, כיוון שהיה בסתמה מצרפין המייסה להזמנה. אבל אם פירש בעת ההנחה דו על מנת לפנתו, שווה להשתמש בו כל אחר כך. In other words, if when I put it inside, I explicitly said, this is not a permanent use, and even though I had hazmana, it's permitted to hold. However, he says, אם עשה כיס לשם תפילין, וצר בית תפילין חדשים, אפילו על מנת לפנותן, אחר כך אסור למצר בזוזי. In other words, if it was made initially to be used for tefillin, and it was used even once, even though it was just a temporary use, then it would have status of a davar shebekdusha. Okay, there's a whole long discussion here on the Be'er Halacha where this is taken from, but that's what he wants to say. This is a higher level of azmana if I actually made it for that, and then even if I used it just temporarily, it would have already the kedusha. Okay, the other nafkamina here is what he says here. Okay, in other words, I can never use it for a davar chol once it has the status of tashmish kedusha. Another point he says here, that once it has a status of tashmish kedusha, not only can I not use it for a davar chol, I can't use it even for something which is lower in kedusha. So he says, וכן שאר דבר, אפילו דבר שיש בו קדושה, כלשהו למטה מתפילין כגון מזוזה. So I cannot use it now for a mezuzah. And he says, ולפי זה אין לתת סידור בכיס שהיה מיוחד מתפילה לתפילין בלבד. ואף על פי כן אין למחות בזה כאבן דרגילים בזה, אבל כאילו יתנם מתחילה. In other words, I wouldn't even be able to put a siddur inside the tefillin bag. Why? Because the siddur has lower kedusha than tefillin. Okay, but he says, since the minhag is to do it, there's a limud zchut that it's considered as if they made at 9 milchatchila. You could put a siddur in there. Okay, we said here in the Ramah that if I made at 9, then I can do it. That's even if I had the zman and everything. If I made at 9, then that's fine. We said here the klaf itself is considered kedusha, and therefore by the kedusha itself, hazman amilta. So here he says you cannot use it for a davar chol, but להורידו מקדושתו כגון לכתוב עליו מזוזה שקדושתה מתפילין ושאר דברי תורה מותר אפילו לא להתקבל לספר תורה. Okay, in other words, here when we say hazman amilta by a davar shebekdusha, just to give us a kedusha, but it's not the specific type of kedusha, and therefore even though I did ibud l'shem tefillin, I could use it for a mezuzah. But he says here nicely, v'get have a davar shel chol v'asur lektovo al klaf hamubad l'sefer Torah. Again, it's not considered the davar shebekdusha; it's a davar chol, and therefore, if I have a klaf which was done ibud l'shem tefillin or sefer Torah, I would not be able to use it afterwards for a get. I mean, this was relevant probably when they still wrote gittin on klaf. The minhag for the past 200 years has been to write it on paper anyway. Okay. So, what else do we have here? He says here at the end, יש אומרים דהיינו דהסודר לא נתקדש על ידי שצר בי פעם אחת בלי הזמנה, אבל כל זמן שהתפילין שם אין מדרך הכבוד להניח יחד שם גם האות, אלא יקשרם בקשר בפני עצמו. In other words, even though we say that if I didn't do hazmana or forever or whatever I made at night, all these things, okay, so the sudar doesn't have kedusha, but nevertheless, it's not correct to put in money together with the tefillin itself. Rather, you should, I don't know, tie them up separately from the tefillin, just out of respect for the tefillin, not to put directly with them a davar chol.
So what about like what some people do have, like some tzedakah coins in the tefillin bag? Would that be different because it's already like the davar mitzvah?
Yeah, that makes sense. Again, I think nowadays anyway it's less of a problem because the tefillin are covered in the plastic boxes, so you're not putting directly with the tefillin. But yeah, it makes sense to say that if it's money for tzedakah, then it's money l'shem mitzvah, so it's not disrespectful for the tefillin. That makes sense. All right, any other questions or comments on hazmana and this? Okay, this is also a big sugya that we'll see in Hilchot Beit Knesset again. But all right, let's move on to the next siman. I'll just stop the recording and restart it.